The soldiers lounged around the cold, steel-gray confines of the space station, their armor clinking lightly as they shifted positions. Scarred from countless campaigns, they laughed, swapping stories of survival on hostile planets with an air of indifference. A veteran squad, these men and women had faced down alien enemies, harsh environments, and impossible odds, emerging victorious each time. They had become used to thinking there was nothing the galaxy could throw at them that they couldn't handle. "Remember that time on Maris?" one soldier smirked, recalling the scorching desert world where they'd fought. "Heat so bad it melted our boots." "Or Asterion," another chimed in, "where the local fauna wanted to eat us alive, and the acid rain nearly did." They laughed again, their stories punctuated by a casual arrogance, the kind born from surviving the worst. Their chatter filled the metallic corridor, bouncing off the walls of the briefing room where they waited. The door slid open, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. In strode the commanding officer, his voice sharp and authoritative as ever. "Listen up. We've got someone here to brief you on the next mission. He's a specialist from Akrosh." The soldiers turned their attention to the figure entering the room behind the commander. Chlorkon stepped forward, his tall, heavily muscled frame drawing attention. He was unlike anything the soldiers had seen before. His skin, a dark, weathered gray, was crisscrossed with scars, old and new, like a living testament to a lifetime of brutal survival. His eyes were piercing, but his demeanor was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the violence his appearance suggested. Akrosh. The name carried weight, even here. Whispers spread among the soldiers as they eyed the alien with mild curiosity. Akrosh was known across the galaxy as one of the most dangerous Deathworlds, a place where even the environment was a constant threat to life. But still, the skepticism lingered in the room. One soldier, notorious for his loud mouth, leaned toward his squadmate with a smirk. "A Deathworld, huh? I mean, Earth isn't exactly a vacation spot either. You ever try surviving a Siberian winter or the Australian outback?" Another chuckled. "Yeah, or swimming with sharks in the open ocean. We've got Deathworlds of our own." Chlorkon remained silent, his gaze steady, as the soldiers continued with their light-hearted banter. Their mockery didn't faze him, but the tension in the air began to grow, the undercurrent of arrogance from the humans becoming palpable. "All right, settle down," the commander barked, cutting through the chatter. "You're about to head to one of the roughest assignments yet. Chlorkon's here to brief you. Pay attention." The soldiers stifled their laughter, but even as the room quieted, they weren't fully convinced. They leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, only half listening, assuming this was just another routine mission. They'd heard warnings before. They'd survived them all. Chlorkon finally spoke, his voice low and measured, like someone who had seen far too much. "You think Earth is dangerous? Where I come from, even the air tries to kill you." The room grew a little quieter, but the skepticism lingered on the faces of the soldiers. Chlorkon continued, his tone calm but carrying the weight of experience. "On Akrosh, every breath is a gamble. The atmosphere is filled with toxins that can paralyze, or worse. The ground shifts beneath your feet, hiding predators waiting to strike. Every living thing has evolved not just to survive, but to kill. There's no safe zone, no place to let your guard down." One of the soldiers raised an eyebrow, glancing around as if waiting for someone to laugh. No one did. Chlorkon's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, unsettling but not yet fully sinking in. "It's not just the wildlife," Chlorkon added. "The planet itself is alive in ways you can't imagine. Mountains that move, rivers that devour, storms that strip flesh from bone. It is constant, relentless. You won't just be fighting an enemy, you'll be fighting the planet itself." A few soldiers exchanged uneasy looks, but most still wore the expressions of disbelief. After all, they'd survived countless planets, faced untold dangers, and lived to tell the tale. What could be worse than what they'd already seen? Chlorkon's gaze moved over them, his face impassive. "You think your stories of survival are impressive. You're not prepared for this. Not yet." And with that, he stepped back, leaving the room in heavy silence, his words lingering in the minds of the soldiers. They didn't laugh this time. Instead, they sat quietly, unsure whether to be intrigued or unnerved by the alien veteran's story. "When I was young, my first assignment was to cross the marshlands of Akrosh. Chlorkon began, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that pulled the room's attention back to him. The air there clings to you like poison. Even the plants were predators. You could walk for days and never see the danger until it had already taken someone from your group. The soldiers leaned in slightly, intrigued despite themselves. This wasn't the usual alien boasting. There was something different about how he spoke. Measured, almost detached. One of my comrades was leading the way. He stepped on what looked like solid ground. Chlorkon's eyes grew distant, remembering. It wasn't. The ground collapsed beneath him, and before we could react, he was gone, not swallowed by quicksand. No, pulled under by a creature that waited below the surface. It didn't even leave a ripple. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, imagining the scene. The silence that followed was suffocating. The predatory patience of an unseen enemy, and that was just the beginning, Chlorkon continued. We couldn't rest, couldn't even close our eyes without the vines creeping toward us. They moved slowly, but they moved. Watching every shadow, listening for every sound, it wears on your mind. The constant fear, knowing something could strike at any moment. The room felt heavier as the tension thickened. The soldiers, used to fighting enemies they could see, began to understand the psychological toll Chlorkon spoke of. No moment was safe. No moment allowed for ease. A few soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The skepticism was still there, but something in the way Chlorkon told the story gnawed at them. There was no bravado, no embellishment, just cold, hard memory. One of them, trying to break the tension, finally spoke up. So, is that why Earth's classified as a death world too? We've got our share of dangers, harsh environments, deadly animals. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of doubt, as if he needed reassurance. Chlorkon turned his gaze toward the speaker. I've studied Earth's records, he replied. Humans are adaptable. Your world can be dangerous, yes. It shapes you to endure, but you've mastered your environment. On Akrosh, the planet never allows mastery. There is no balance, only survival. The silence that followed was charged with unease. The soldier who had hoped for a comparison found no comfort in Chlorkon's response. Earth was deadly, but Akrosh was something else entirely. Even the creatures, Chlorkon continued, voice lowering, are like nothing you've seen. They don't just hunt, they plan. His eyes narrowed as he recalled another memory. I led a squad through one of the jungles on Akrosh, dense with vegetation so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. We knew the predators were there, waiting. We thought we could anticipate them, but we were wrong. The soldiers were quiet now, drawn into the story against their will. The room seemed smaller, colder, as Chlorkon's voice filled it. We were ambushed by creatures that blended so perfectly with their surroundings, we didn't see them until they attacked. And when they did, he paused, his jaw tightening. They didn't just charge, they separated us, forced us into traps they had set beforehand. They knew we'd panic. They used our fear against us. A chill ran through the room. The idea that a creature could outthink them, that they could be prey, was unsettling. Chlorkon's calm, matter-of-fact tone only made it worse. He wasn't trying to impress them. He was simply recounting what he had lived through, and that made it all the more horrifying. Only a few of us made it out, Chlorkon continued. Those who did, they weren't the strongest. They were the ones who adapted, who learned to think like the creatures we faced. That's what survival on a death world requires. Not just strength, not just skill, but a complete shift in how you see the world. Everything is a threat. The weight of his words settled in. The soldiers who had begun the briefing with dismissive arrogance were now silent. They had faced enemies, harsh conditions, yes, but nothing like this. Nothing where the planet itself seemed to conspire against you, where the creatures could think and plan. As if reading the shift in the room, Chlorkon finally spoke again. The world we're about to land on, it reminds me of Akrosh. Not exactly, but close enough. His eyes swept over the soldiers, assessing their reactions. You'll face wildlife that has evolved to kill anything that breathes. The environment itself will be your enemy. If you're not prepared, if you don't adapt, it will kill you before the enemy does. A heavy silence followed. No one made a joke this time. No one dared. For the first time, they began to realize that Chlorkon wasn't just telling stories. He was warning them, and they weren't sure they were ready for what was coming. The descent to the planet was smooth, uneventful even, which only bolstered the soldiers' confidence. They exited their craft, stepping onto the alien soil with the swagger of veterans who had seen it all. Chlorkan's warnings still echoed in their minds, but most dismissed them. They had survived worse, or so they believed. The terrain stretched out before them, barren yet somehow off. The ground was cracked and jagged, as if it had been twisted and warped over time. Strange thin mists clung to the surface, swirling around their feet like tendrils. Off to the side, vines twisted unnaturally, growing in directions that defied logic. The sky above was a dull gray, the air heavy with something they couldn't quite place, but nothing seemed outright dangerous. They began setting up camp. Tents went up, supplies were unpacked, and patrols were sent out to survey the area. A few soldiers glanced around, unease gnawing at them, but the others quickly brushed it off. "Guess Chlorkan was just telling stories after all," one soldier muttered, earning a few chuckles from the others. They joked and bantered as they worked, their old bravado returning. The planet might have been strange, but it wasn't the living nightmare Chlorkan had described, at least not yet. Without warning, the ground beneath them shifted. What had been solid just moments before rippled like liquid, sending equipment tumbling. One of the supply crates started sinking, as if being swallowed by the earth itself. Soldiers scrambled to secure it, but the more they struggled, the faster it disappeared into the ground. "Everyone back!" someone yelled, but it was too late. The ground opened in a jagged maw, swallowing the crate whole, leaving nothing but cracked earth in its wake. Panic set in as the soldiers looked around. The mists thickened, curling around their legs, and then came the stench. Sharp, acrid. Gases began leaking from fissures in the ground, their origin unknown. A soldier nearest to one of the cracks staggered back, coughing violently, his eyes wide with fear. The air itself had turned against them. And then the plants, the vines which had seemed dormant just minutes ago, came to life, lashing out with terrifying "peed." One soldier, caught off guard, was yanked into the air, her scream cut short as the vine coiled around her throat, tightening. The camp descended into chaos. Soldiers fired blindly into the mist, trying to fend off the environment itself, but their weapons did nothing against the living planet. The ground shifted beneath their feet, vines snaked toward them, and strange, unseen creatures began darting through the fog. The air was thick with tension and the sounds of desperate shouts. "This isn't right," someone yelled, panic creeping into their voice. "We're not fighting an army, we're fighting the planet." As soldiers fell and confusion spread, Chlorkan moved into the fray, his voice cutting through the chaos with a commanding calm. "Stop firing, you're wasting ammunition." They ignored him at first, still too caught up in the madness, but as the situation worsened, they had no choice but to listen. "Follow my lead," Chlorkan barked, stepping forward. "You can't fight this like a normal battle, you're only making yourselves targets." He moved with purpose, navigating the treacherous terrain like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His voice, calm but firm, was the only thing keeping the soldiers from falling apart. "The ground is unstable. Spread out, keep light on your feet. Avoid the cracks. Don't fire until you see what you're aiming at." The soldiers, their earlier arrogance now long gone, clung to his every word. They followed his lead, spreading out as he instructed, no longer fighting the planet directly, but moving with it, avoiding the shifting terrain, keeping their distance from the predatory vines. Chlorkan moved toward the fallen soldier who had been ensnared, cutting her free with a precise slash from his blade. He was calm, methodical, while the soldiers around him fought back their fear. "They react to movement," Chlorkan continued, his voice unwavering. "Stay still when the vines come. Move only when you have to." Slowly, they began to regain control. The wild, erratic firing ceased as they learned to move in sync with the alien environment. Chlorkan, ever the survivor, used the planet's hostility against it. He set traps using the very vines that had attacked them, creating obstacles for the creatures lurking in the mist. Soldiers followed suit, turning the battlefield into a deadly maze for their unseen enemy. At his command, they began using the terrain's dangers as weapons. They lured creatures into the unstable ground, where they were swallowed by the shifting earth. They avoided the thickest of the mists, knowing it concealed the deadliest gases. Under Chlorkan's guidance, the soldiers stopped fighting the planet and started surviving it. The tide of the battle turned, but not because they were overpowering their enemy. No, they were adapting, learning, just as Chlorkan had warned them they would need to. The creatures were still there, the environment still hostile. But the soldiers were no longer simply reacting in fear. They were thinking, planning, using the planet's own lethal unpredictability to their advantage. The once cocky veterans who had landed on this planet with jokes and bravado were now silent, their expressions grim and focused. Chlorkan had been right all along, and it had taken this world to teach them the lesson. By the time they had regained some semblance of control, they had already been changed. This was no longer just another mission. They had faced a death world, and they knew now that Chlorkan's stories weren't exaggerations. They were warnings, hard-earned from a life spent surviving where no one should. The final push came swiftly, yet deliberately. Under Chlorkan's guidance, the soldiers moved with precision, navigating the treacherous landscape with a newfound understanding. They didn't just charge blindly into the enemy's line. No, they adapted. The planet's hostile nature, once their greatest foe, had now become their weapon. Chlorkan's instructions were brief, calculated. Use the terrain, let them come to you. The alien forces, confident in their advantage, advanced with arrogance, expecting the humans to falter as they had before. But this time was different. The soldiers used the unstable ground to lure their enemies into traps, setting off hidden pockets of gas to blind them, using the predatory vines to ensnare them. The alien soldiers found themselves fighting not just the humans, but the planet itself, just as Chlorkan had described. The humans struck hard and fast, hitting the enemy with both tactical force and ingenuity. They adapted on the fly, reading the battlefield and using every resource available, no longer panicked, but strategic. When the alien forces tried to regroup, they were met with a wave of coordinated attacks. The planet, once seemingly insurmountable, now worked in tandem with the human offensive. Even Chlorkan, who had expected a long, drawn-out battle, was impressed with how quickly they dismantled the alien defenses. The final moments of the battle came swiftly. A last push, one coordinated strike. The alien forces, once dominant, were routed. In the aftermath, the battlefield was eerily silent. The mists still swirled, the vines still twisted, but the immediate threat had passed. Soldiers, battle-worn but alive, gathered in small groups. Their faces, once filled with cocky arrogance, were now marked by exhaustion and a quiet understanding. They looked around at the carnage, the scars left on both the alien enemy and the hostile planet. Their near-death experience had changed them. There was no bravado left, no jokes or dismissive attitudes. They had seen firsthand what Chlorkan had warned them about. This world, with all its dangers, had nearly claimed them, and yet they had survived. A few soldiers, sitting by the remains of their camp, exchanged hushed words, reflecting on the battle. One of them spoke softly. "We almost didn't make it out of here. I thought I'd seen it all before, but this was something else." The others nodded in agreement, their earlier cockiness gone, replaced with a sober respect for the galaxy's dangers. Chlorkan stood a little apart, watching them. His large frame, scarred and battle-hardened, seemed even more imposing in the low light of the fading day. But there was a new expression on his face, something close to admiration. These soldiers had faced down a death world's brutality and adapted quicker than he had expected. Where other species might have broken, humanity had bent but never snapped. As the soldiers gathered themselves, Chlorkan finally approached them. His voice, though still calm, carried a deeper tone of respect. "I've fought many wars, on many worlds," he said. "I have never seen a species adapt as quickly as yours. What I told you about Akrash was true, but I see now that your strength isn't just in your weapons or your tactics, it's in how you refuse to be broken." The soldiers, once dismissive of him, now listened intently. His words weren't boastful, they were honest. One of the soldiers, covered in dirt and blood, stood up and faced Chlorkan. "We owe you for this one. Without you, none of us would have made it." Chlorkan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the gratitude. "Perhaps," he said, "but it was your instincts that kept you alive. No species I've fought alongside has a survival instinct as raw as yours. You adapt, you survive." The soldiers exchanged glances, a newfound respect reflected in their eyes. They had relied on each other, sure, but Chlorcan had been the key to understanding the planet's hostility. Without his guidance, they might never have lasted through the battle. As they prepared to depart, there was no talk of glory or victory in the traditional sense. The mood was more grounded, more thoughtful. These soldiers had been forever changed by what they had faced. Their confidence was still there, but now it was tempered with a humility that hadn't been present before. They knew the galaxy was far more dangerous than they'd once believed, and they respected that danger now. Chlorcan, too, had changed. He had arrived skeptical of humanity's resilience, expecting them to falter in the face of true adversity. But now, standing alongside them, he recognized their strength. It wasn't just that they had survived. They had overcome, adapted, and even used the environment against their enemy in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the soldiers boarded their transport, one of them paused, looking back at the scarred battlefield they were leaving behind. "Guess Chlorcan wasn't exaggerating after all," he muttered, half to himself. Another soldier, overhearing, smirked. "No, but now we know. There's nothing the galaxy can throw at us that we can't handle. We survived a Deathworld." There was pride in his voice, but it was quiet, earned. And as the doors closed and the ship lifted off, the soldiers carried with them a deeper understanding of their place in the galaxy. They weren't just soldiers. They were human. And if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was surviving, no matter the odds. No Deathworld, no enemy, no challenge could break them. Chlorcan watched as they departed, a slight smile tugging at his scarred face. Humanity had earned his respect. They were survivors through and through. And he knew that, in the end, that raw, unyielding spirit would carry them through any battle, any world. Humanity, indeed.